I'm a fan of the Octatrack. I've even got two of them. But since most of my channel is essentially an Octatrack advertisement, I felt I should balance things out a bit around here, as there are more than a few reasons why you probably shouldn't buy one. So let's discuss some of these weak points in no particular order. Tiny screen. Look at that thing! It's a screen for ants! The Mark II screen is nice and bright with fantastic viewing angles, but it's even tinier than the Mark I screen. On top of that, if you want to take your Octatrack outside, the new screen is a dubious upgrade at best. Organic LED screens have a hard time in brightly lit conditions, whereas the old school LCD of the original Mark I works excellently even in full sunlight. Menus upon menus upon menus. In order to begin understanding the Octatrack requires that you memorize its data structure and the basic layout of the menus and submenus. If you have a poor working memory and experience difficulties visualizing and internalizing abstract networks of functionality, the Octatrack is probably not for you. Limited RAM recording and playback memory. One of the main things keeping the Octatrack from putting your DAW out of business is the relative scarcity of RAM available for recording purposes. For many use cases, the amount of RAM on the Octatrack is a non-issue, but the ability of the Octatrack to capture longer recordings is very limited and becomes even more limited at 24-bit. The recording setup menu displays how much time you have available for recording. I have it set up here for the maximum amount of time available when recording at 16-bit. Only one sampler rate supported. Another aspect that severely limits the ability of the Octatrack to act as a production center is the inability to properly playback any sample rate other than 44.1 kHz. And there are absolutely no facilities for sample rate conversion. Similarly, there is no support for applying dither to audio files, although I'd say that expecting something like the Octatrack to have that capability is more than a bit of a reach. But I'd like to have it anyway, because I'm greedy like that. Only 8 playback channels and 16 simultaneous effects. The Octatrack has only 8 channels of audio playback, and although they are stereo, they lack polyphony and are monophonic. Further, if you want more than 2 insert effects per channel, you have to sacrifice another audio playback channel. Similarly, in order to apply effects to the master bus requires sacrificing yet another playback channel. These fairly severe limitations can encourage efficient and creative usage of the Octatrack's capabilities, but sometimes they're just annoying. Neighbor channels disable amplifier page. Why wouldn't I want dynamic control and access to an envelope and VCA at the gain stage between a source track and its neighbor effects track? Perhaps there are technical reasons, but from the user's standpoint, it makes no sense whatsoever. To avoid confusion, any neighbor machine's amplifier page could simply default to being wide open when a neighbor track is assigned. No high-resolution MIDI data sent or received. The Octatrack does not support high-resolution MIDI control of any kind, including pitch bend. The way I use it, I generally don't even think about this limitation, but having proper access to pitch bend would be very nice. And for some people, it's probably a deal breaker. Limited rhythmic resolution. The maximum step resolution of the Octatrack is 1/384th of a step. It's simply unable to capture all the nuances of human-produced rhythms. And to get the finest control possible over note placements requires a delicate combination of micro-timing and swing trigs. Not exactly the most convenient solution. 4-note maximum MIDI polyphony. The way the MIDI sequencer implements polyphony is extremely simplistic, and to be able to produce overlapping notes that don't cut each other off requires a workaround that uses multiple MIDI tracks simultaneously. So you can just forget about trying to live record these kinds of musical gestures. Audio tracks have no velocity sensitivity. When controlling audio tracks with MIDI, there's no velocity sensitivity. When you factor in the polyphony limitations of a single MIDI track and the limited rhythmic resolution, it's clear the Octatrack was not designed for the live instrumentalist type of electronic musician. Confusing MIDI implementation. The MIDI aspects of the Octatrack are very powerful, but all of the features and options are overwhelming, and the manual is very little help in demystifying the Octatrack MIDI implementation. More than a few rather tricky aspects and details are barely mentioned, if at all, MIDI issues and bugs. If you do brave the MIDI side of the Octatrack and are interested in doing something more than just the basics, you're likely to discover some of the lingering MIDI issues and bugs. Half of the time, when I've encountered these types of things, I'm not sure if it's a bug or if I simply misinterpreted the manual. Getting the Octatrack working happily as part of a more complex MIDI setup is almost always a trial by fire. Button combo-centric user interface. If you consider the Octatrack to essentially be a bastardized DAW that requires you to operate it exclusively by using keyboard shortcuts, you'll be ahead of the game. Doesn't make it any less frustrating, but you'll certainly get used to stretching those hands out. Only one control that has a single purpose. There's only a single control on the Octatrack that serves only one function, the headphone volume, which on the Mark I unit was confusingly labeled with just volume. If you don't like a lack of dedicated controls, it's probably best to stay away from the Octatrack. Lack of a Control All feature. The lack of a Control All function on the Octatrack can be chalked up to the inclusion of scenes, but I don't consider scenes to be a direct replacement for Control All functionality, as they require more pre-planning and do not change the default values of the parts, since scene locks are abstracted into their own control layer, which certainly has its own advantages. However, Control All functionality can be emulated on the Octatrack using MIDI loopback, but native functionality would be much more useful and usable. Only 4 inputs, only 4 outputs. 4 channels in and 4 channels out makes for a nice and efficient design, but given the modular nature of the Octatrack, it really cripples the device. If the Octatrack had more inputs, it would be much more capable as a performance mixer and effects box, and if it had more outputs, it would lend itself much better to tightly integrating with outboard mixers and effects. Having only 4 inputs and 4 outputs on a device like the Octatrack is essentially equivalent to filling and draining a swimming pool with a drinking straw. Lacks file type support. Forget about loading up some MP3s. Everything you want the Octatrack to play back properly needs to be stored as 44.1 kHz, 16 or 24-bit WAVE or AIFF. It will play back different sample rates, but the pitch will be incorrect. LFOs cannot be routed across tracks. So far, the only Elektron that can route its LFOs to control other tracks is the venerable Machine Drum. Using MIDI loopback, you can gain extra LFOs that can be routed relatively freely, but MIDI loopback introduces various issues and is not always a viable solution. LFOs have limited P-lockability. Although the LFOs on the Octatrack have many options available in the LFO setup menu, the only parameters of the LFOs that can be modulated by P-locks, scenes, or other LFOs are the depth and speed parameters. This is a step backwards from the Machine Drum, which has an LFO shape mix parameter accessible, and a substantial step backwards from the Mono Machine, which allows for modulating every single one of the LFO parameters, including the destination. Looks like an overgrown calculator. I like the look of the Mark I, but it's nerd chic at best, and rather militaristic. The Mark II looks like some sort of hideous carnival ride though, so I'm just fine with the Mark I. The Mark II also reminds me slightly of the new Roland boxes. Ugh. Lots and lots of manual reading. The Octatrack manual presents an interesting conundrum in the sense that you have to already know how to use the Octatrack before the manual even becomes worth reading. Generally speaking, most of the manual is indecipherable and hopelessly cryptic to anyone that lacks substantial hands-on use. But if you really want to know how to work the Octatrack, reading the manual is not optional. Dark reverb overloads easily. I quite like the Octatrack's dark reverb, but it's very sensitive to signal levels, and there's very limited ability to control its internal gain. This quickly leads to distortion and clipping. The ease of internally overloading the dark reverb, combined with all the low-level hash and artifacts it introduces, can make for a very grainy and lo-fi reverb tail. Some extra setup options for internal gain and feedback levels would be very helpful. No pre-delay on either plate or spring reverb. They put a pre-delay on the dark reverb, but why didn't they put a pre-delay in the effects setup for the spring reverb or the plate reverb? I'm hoping it's for technical reasons, so I can give them a pass on this one, because otherwise, for shame, Elektron. Spring reverb sounds pretty awful. I have to say the spring reverb is pretty bad, but I've slowly developed somewhat of a fondness for it, except for spring type C, which borders on unusable due to the extremely high noise floor it introduces. I also find the lack of pre-delay hurts the usability of the spring reverb even more so than it affects the plate reverb. Filter is not transparent at maximum cutoff frequency. By default, there's a filter assigned to every track. This is nice in the sense that I'd say the filter is the effect that I use the most on the Octatrack, but it's rather obnoxious as the filter degrades audio even at default dry settings where the cutoff frequency is at maximum. It noticeably alters the phase and frequency content of the signal. No limiter, and the compressor cannot act as a true limiter. On the processing side of things, the primary oversight holding the Octatrack back from acting as a standalone music production station is the lack of a true peak limiter. The shortest attack time available on the compressor is half a millisecond. Lo-fi faux pas. Much like the filter, the instant you assign the lo-fi effect to a track, you're fundamentally degrading your sound quality, even at default dry settings. The lo-fi effect is even more egregious than the filter though, and has a rather low internal threshold for where clipping and saturation begin to occur. The distortion available by using the lo-fi effect is interesting, but somewhat limited and rather harsh. I'd like to be able to use the amplitude modulator more often, but the significant degradation to sound quality by simply adding the lo-fi effect into the effects chain is rarely worth it. Trig buttons, not velocity sensitive. It would be cool if the trig buttons on the Octatrack had velocity sensitivity, but to be perfectly honest, I'd mostly want to just keep velocity turned off. Over time, I've gotten attached to the simple button switches as well, and having velocity sensitivity would most likely require using a different part. No latch for scene button activation. This one is very much a straight up feature request. Some of my playing technique for the Octatrack focuses around how I plan to hold down the scene buttons, and being able to latch a held scene button would open things up considerably, while also making typical scene construction workflow a bit less awkward and tedious. It would be very nice to have a one-handed scene construction workflow. Compact flash card reader. One of the most sensitive points of mechanical failure on the Octatrack is the relatively delicate compact flash card slot. It is very easy to damage or bend some of the internal contact pins. Standard practice on the Octatrack is to just get a very big compact flash card and never remove it, but it can still potentially take some hits during transport or even just when moving some gear around in the studio. Time stretch algorithm is not very good and is always turned on by default. It's nice to have time stretch, but I really don't use it that often, so I'm constantly turning it off. With time stretch enabled by default and a filter automatically placed on every track, it's not that surprising that a lot of people have felt the Octatrack has difficulty transparently playing back samples. Repitching algorithm leaves a lot to be desired. Pitching samples up in a satisfying way is always a good bit more challenging to do than pitching down a sample, but the repitching on the Octatrack quickly leads to extremely harsh sounds, even when pitching up just a few semitones. Electron is cagey, and will probably just release a Mark III out of nowhere. One reason not to buy an Octatrack anytime soon is that Electron is a rather secretive company and will likely drop something new out of nowhere. Whether that's a Mark III Octatrack or some brand new flagship that dethrones it. Lack of level meters. It's very difficult to know for sure when using the Octatrack where exactly you are clipping or where you might be clipping. Other than a few LEDs, there's essentially no metering of any kind, and the only way to make sure you aren't clipping is to resort to internal resampling so you can take a proper look at the waveform. And unfortunately, that type of analysis can only take you so far. This is rather helpful for forcing you to develop your ears, but it's rather frustrating when you're just trying to make some music and want to make sure you aren't clipping in your internal signal chain. It takes as much or more time to learn as an actual DAW, but offers a fraction of the functionality. The Octatrack is a true instrument and demands to be treated as such. However, it's also basically a DAW in a box, so requires a very different mindset than a traditional instrument. This hefty combination of learning requirements starts to seem rather unappealing when you consider the limitations of the Octatrack and how it only offers a fraction of the functionality of your typical DAW. You're basically spending months, or even years, learning how to use something that's essentially already obsolete. Obviously, I don't entirely subscribe to this line of thinking, but I can definitely see where other people are coming from with this one. DJ EQ changes phase even when dry. Don't put the DJ EQ on any sounds you aren't willing to significantly degrade. Even at default dry settings, it introduces significant phasing issues. EQs in general are of questionable quality. I wouldn't recommend to apply the EQs of the Octatrack to the master bus. They are simply not of a high enough quality. However, I have found the low shelf and the high shelf settings of the general purpose EQ to be relatively transparent and useful even in a master bus application. But using a parametric band seems to quickly trash the sound quality. The best distortions available on the Octatrack are hiding in the filter setup page and the compressor. As I've already stated, I personally find the lo-fi effects distortion to be of very limited use, due to both its sonic character as well as how it affects the level of the audio. The Octatrack does offer some decent distortions, but both of my favorite sources of Octatrack distortion are a bit hidden. In the filter setup page, there is a distortion parameter that's somewhat similar to the lo-fi effect, but I find it far more usable and think it sounds a bit better. The other main source of distortion I go to on the Octatrack is the compressor, which offers oodles of gain. And neither of these are the first places you'd look for distortion and saturation effects on the Octatrack. No USB MIDI. The USB port serves only one function: to enable the Octatrack to be a compact flashcard reader for your computer. So don't expect to use it for anything except transferring files. Special characters you shouldn't use. According to Rusty, the creator of OctaEdit, you really should stay away from all these interesting characters if you don't want your files to be accidentally corrupted. Octatrack forces you to do things the Octatrack way. What I've outlined so far are just a fraction of the reasons you might not want to buy an Octatrack, as squeezing the most out of the Octatrack generally requires and encourages a very different mindset than most gear. If you're someone that tends to be impatient and has a hard time being detail-oriented, this is the absolute last piece of equipment that I would recommend. That being said, the Octatrack has more to offer than any other single piece of music gear I've ever owned. If you're already an Octatrack owner, what are some of your biggest annoyances? If you don't have an Octatrack but are interested, what's holding you back? It's an idiosyncratic instrument with a very particular way of approaching things, and like most of the best things in life, it's simply not for everyone. Ugh. 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 Ugh.